As noted in the last lecture, if we don't have free will, we need to think carefully about whether and how we should adjust our practices of punishment. For, according to free will skeptics, the absence of free will means that no one is truly guilty in any deep sense, so no one deserves punishment. Each of us, criminal and do-gooder alike, has their lot by luck. So if I'm an upstanding citizen, that's just my good luck. And if John is a criminal, that's just his bad luck. And so neither of us deserves punishment. So it's inappropriate to have these kinds of retributive attitudes that we saw discussed in the previous lecture. These kinds of issues, all of the issues that were discussed in the last lecture, focus on the ethics of punishment. And we saw that there's no theory of punishment that escapes unscathed from philosophical reservations. The view that seems to fit best with our common sense views is retributivism, the idea that the guilty deserve to be punished and the innocent deserve not to be punished. But many philosophers maintain that retributivism lacks any sound justification, and it also seems to depend on the problematic assumption that we have free will. The forward-looking alternatives that we saw, utilitarianism, rehabilitation, and quarantine, are easier to justify in some sense, that they're easier to sort of say why they're appropriate, because you justify them in terms of their good social outcomes. But all of these theories have counterintuitive implications, and most importantly, they make us give up on the idea of guilt altogether. So we don't get to keep any of our ordinary ideas of retributivism and guilt at all. Now, all of these questions so far, as I said, concern ethics, the ethical propriety of punishment. We've given no attention at all to whether the different practices of punishment would be effective. But everyone who's party to this discussion agrees that we need something that will provide an effective means of social control. That is, everyone agrees that we need to have some set of practices in place that will keep society in order, that will work to minimize crime. So we need to know when punishment is effective at keeping society in order. It's all well and good to say that punishment is only ethical when it meets such and such conditions, but what actually works to minimize crime and immoral conduct? The first kind of punishment or sanctioning that we considered in the last lecture was vengeance and blood feud. And our question today is, do these forms of punishment, vengeance and blood feud, work? And you might wonder, what good could vengeance do at all? It can seem like it could only ever make things worse. This issue is discussed in Robert Frank's excellent book, Passions Within Reason. Frank is an economist at Cornell University, and he starts out his book with a passage from the Hatfields and the McCoys. The passage from a history of the Hatfields and the McCoys, and it describes one episode in the cycle of violence. The Hatfields had arranged to wipe out the McCoys by setting fire to their farmhouse and just waiting for people to come out and kill them as they came out. The first one who was shot was Alifair McCoy, and her mother, Sarah, went out to go to her, but one of the Hatfields knocked her down with the butt of his rifle, and she laid stunned on the ground for a moment, and then, again, according to this history, she, quote, she raised herself on her hands and knees and tried to crawl to Alifair. She pleaded with the attackers, "For God's sake, let me go to my girl." Then, realizing the situation, she cried, "Oh, she's dead. For the love of God, let me go to her." Sarah then reached out her hand until she could almost touch her daughter, and then one of the Hatfields pounded her skull with the pistol. Although this gory episode claimed the lives of Alifair and her brother, several of the McCoys escaped, and the feud would continue, with each side taking more casualties. The history of the Hatfields and the McCoys makes vengeance and retaliation seem deeply irrational. Why would anyone continue such a course? It just means more and more losses. The McCoys attacked the Hatfields, then the Hatfields attacked the McCoys, and it kept going. And this raises the question, what good can vengeance possibly do for anyone? Frank begins his book this way because he wants to raise the question in our minds, what good could vengeance really do? And he says that, well, this kind of vengeful behavior does have an important function. Namely, it lets others know that you are not to be trifled with. Of course, with the Hatfields and the McCoys, this got way out of hand, and the escalating costs were tragic for both sides. But the basic idea of vengeance, Frank says, is to signal that you are willing to exact revenge. And this is important because it provides a kind of deterrent effect. If your enemy knows that you'll strike out if he steals from you, then this will make him think twice about stealing from you. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is that for any given burst of retaliation, it might not be in a person's short-term best interests to do the retaliation. But a reputation for retaliation might be extremely important in signaling that you will not tolerate being cheated or mistreated. And that signal can very much work in your favor in the long run. This is one of the key points of Frank's account. In terms of immediate cost-benefit analysis, it can seem irrational to spend resources to retaliate. Often in terms of immediate resources, attacking a person only seems to produce more losses. So if Fred steals and eats one of John's chickens, and John can't get the chicken back, what's the advantage of attacking Fred? At a minimum, John could spend the time trying to get more chickens. Moreover, he might get hurt in attacking Fred. So in stealer, very important to preserve your reputation. It's often be full of and be critical to protecting one's resources. And there's a good real-world contemporary example of this with the group Turkana, which are a group of herders in Kenya. They're cattle ranchers who are in constant struggle with tribes that are surrounding that they just call the enemy. And the problem is that the cattle ranchers, the Turkana, are at risk of having their things stolen from them. And so these people tend to be armed with machine guns to try to protect their property. They need to show how fierce they are. That's a very important part of Turkana life. If you seem weak and vulnerable, you will be attacked. And if you really don't have the strength to repel the attack, you will lose everything. And even if you do repel the enemy, there will often be heavy costs. So being known as fierce, as being a retaliator, is a highly valued status in Turkana culture. Another feature of honor cultures that's interesting is that when your kin is harmed, the interest is not in trying to send the perpetrator to prison. That doesn't satisfy you. It delays the process of vengeance. And again, this makes sense in terms of reputation. You need to display your fierceness. You need to display your ability to take matters into your own hands and get your own restitution. This is actually reflected in the advice that Andrew Jackson was given by his mother. She said, quote, "Never sue anybody for slander or assault and battery. Always settle them cases yourself." I assume this advice came before he became president. But you can see how it resonates with the idea that you need to show that you are tough and you can handle it yourself. As noted in the previous lecture, the idea of vengeance can seem appalling to our current sensibilities. However, now we can see something important about its effectiveness. It might seem stupid and pointless. It might seem backward in the pejorative sense that absolutely nothing good comes of it. But in certain social contexts, it can be essential to self-preservation, and it can play an important part in social regulation, because vengeance and the threat of vengeance provide an important deterrent against violating another person's rights and property. And it's a deterrent that people understand. And we can also now see why vengeance would differ from retribution in important ways, that guilt and innocence are not going to be so important when what is important is showing your fierceness or showing that you will retaliate. Similarly, proportionality isn't so important when what you're really trying to do is show to the other people that you will not tolerate that kind of behavior. So striking back in disproportionate ways can be to your advantage. Interestingly, the history of law indicates that the early codes often seem to be designed to preempt vengeance, to sort of work with the vengeance system that was in place. That the laws would often indicate that the wrongdoer had to pay the victim to pacify him. Or in the case of murder, payments were made to the kin. And the payment system like this was in clear evidence in the early laws of the English kings. And it also seems to be in place in the earliest legal code we have, which is the Ur-Nammu Code from about 2050 BCE. We find the system of fines for things like wounding others. So let me give one example of one of the items for the Ur-Nammu Code. It says, If a man has cut off the nose of another man, he shall pay 2/3 of a mina of silver. I hope that was a lot of money if it was going to cover a nose. Now, when we turn to contemporary modes of state-sponsored punishment, it's difficult to assess which systems of punishment work best. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that determining the relation between state-sponsored punishment and criminal behavior is complicated because there are so many factors. So there are economic pressures, there are effects of age on recidivism, there are environmental triggers. All of these things and many others can make it hard to see what effect the punishment itself, just the punishment, has on criminality. A second reason it's difficult to assess the effectiveness of a particular kind of punishment, whether it be rehabilitation or retributivism, is that the data are largely historical in nature. It's hard to run true experiments that manipulate just a single factor. So let's say if what you want to know is whether hard labor reduces crime, well, the best test would be to have two groups, one of which was assigned to the hard labor condition and the other of which wasn't, and then see what the outcome would be down the road. But you'd really want to do this in two separate societies, and it just becomes really impractical to run these kinds of true experiments. So that's another reason why it's difficult to assess which penal system really works. And then the third reason is that the issue is just so highly politicized and moralized, and it makes it hard to see through the rhetoric to see what the data really show. In the US, of course, a lengthy prison sentence is the central means of punishment for serious offenses. This is relatively recent. It dates back not much farther than the 19th century. Before that, punishment was largely a local affair. It was cheap and corporal. People got whipped or put in the stockades. The 19th century saw the development of penitentiaries, and importantly, these were aimed at reforming the wrongdoer. They were called penitentiaries because the convicts were supposed to be penitent. They were supposed to be sorry for their sins, basically. And they were supposed to be, in the early days of the penitentiary, silent. The aim to keep penitentiaries silent went by the wayside. But even through the first 2/3 of the 20th century, reform or rehabilitation was a primary aim of state-sponsored punishment, or as the euphemism has it, corrections. So one of the humanitarian approaches to punishment that we saw in the previous lecture, rehabilitation, something like that was the guiding vision for a lot of the theory behind the system. Well, how did the goal of reform fare? Were criminals reformed? One uncontroversial claim is that historically, prison failed to provide wide-scale reform. If you look at recidivism rates, the rates of repeat offenses, there's little reason to think that prison generally corrected most inmates. It didn't make most inmates into moral and law-abiding citizens who weren't already moral and law-abiding citizens. And so this remains true to this day. People who go to prison are much more likely to commit crimes when they leave prison as compared to other individuals of the same age and ethnicity. This doesn't show that prison has no reformative effects. It may well have reformative effects, but it clearly doesn't have the large-scale reformative effects that one might have hoped for. In the 1960s and 70s, many researchers came to think that rehabilitation fared very poorly indeed. The best studies at the time seemed to suggest that rehabilitation was a complete bust, and the phrase that got picked up was "nothing works." That phrase became the battle cry for those who opposed the rehabilitation theory of punishment. It turns out probably to be an exaggeration to say that nothing works in rehabilitation. Some rehabilitation programs have shown some success under certain circumstances with certain populations. Nonetheless, I think it can be said without controversy that rehabilitation has been much less successful than many had hoped and expected. In the wake of the disappointments over rehabilitation since the 1970s, there has been a return to an avowedly retributivist view of punishment in the U.S. system. And this is the just desserts approach to crime. The idea is people should get the punishment that fits their crime simply because they deserve it. And this brings us back full circle to the theory of punishment that fits our intuitions, retributivism. So retributivism is once again an important part of the way we think about punishment in the social context, quite explicitly. Now, Although the historical trends here are interesting and the criminological data is interesting, the evidence is so messy that it's very difficult to get a clear read on what really is and isn't effective in state-sponsored punishment. In my own reading of the evidence, it seems to me that the punishment system in the U.S. does provide some deterrent effect on crime, but it's unclear to what extent it does, and this still remains an area of huge controversy. So I'd like to switch gears and focus on laboratory studies on punishment, since they have the virtue of being carefully controlled. And for that, we'll look to recent work in an area that's called experimental economics. This area of economics conducts experiments on people playing various kinds of economic games with real money. One thriving issue in experimental economics has been the extent to which people are willing to punish others at a cost to themselves. And then in addition, the extent to which such punishment would improve behavior. Let's start with the work on whether people are willing to punish others at a cost to themselves. So, one standard economic game that they use in these experiments is called a public goods game. In one familiar version, there are 4 people in the game, and each of them is given an allotment of money that they can contribute to a common fund. So basically, each of them gets, let's say, $20, and they can invest some or all of that money into a common fund, and for each dollar that's contributed, every player gets 40 cents. So if I contribute $1, everybody gets 40 cents, but that means I get 40 cents. But notice that it's a net gain for the group because my dollar got turned into $1.60. But I myself just get 40 cents back. So it's a net gain for the group, but a loss for the individual contributing. Investing is good for the group, but selfishly speaking, it's best not to invest and just hope that the others do. And this is all done in these experiments on computers, and it's entirely anonymous. So the way it's set up is there's just basically a big room with a bunch of computers and a bunch of people sitting at them, and you don't know who is in the game that you're playing. In one experiment, participants played several rounds of these kinds of games, but it was made clear at the beginning that they would never be in the same group more than once. That is, they would never play with any of the same players again. So they play against 3 people, and then they play against a new set of 3 people, and so on. For each round, the players were told what the other players had contributed. They were identified by number, so again, it was all anonymous. So you play the game, you decide how much to contribute, you find out what other people contributed, and then you're given an opportunity to punish the other players in the round. This is how the punishment works. If you pay $1, then the person you're punishing would get penalized $3. Now, since you never play the same person again, it's not to your personal advantage financially to punish. In fact, it's to your personal disadvantage because punishment costs money. Nonetheless, in these experiments, most people punished at least once. And mostly what happened was people would punish what you might think of as defectors, the people who didn't contribute the sort of average amount that most people were contributing. So people were willing to pay to punish those who weren't contributing. Since there's no personal advantage in this, the researchers called it altruistic punishment. Let me review this again quickly. So players are given, say, $20, and they're told that they can invest in a common fund together with 3 other anonymous players. After they make their decisions about whether to invest, they get to see how much the others invested. And then they're allowed to pay to punish. And most people in this experiment were willing to pay to punish. Why did they do this? Well, the researchers proposed that people punish because of anger. They feel angry towards the defectors who don't invest. They expect to feel angry if they encounter such a defector later, too. Another study explored this issue of punishment in a different way. And this game is only played once, and again it involves giving money. In this case, there are 3 players. They're randomly assigned to the role of dictator, recipient, and observer. So the dictator is given a sum of money, say $20. And he gets to decide how much to give to the recipient. So he can decide, I'll give him $10, I'll give him $5, I'll give him $1. The dictator gets to decide, and whatever he says I'm going to give to the recipient, that's it. That's how much the recipient gets, and the dictator gets to walk away with the rest of it. The observer, the third person here, is also given an allotment of money, and he is free to keep it all, or if he so chooses, he can pay to punish the dictator. So he can give money, as before, to have money taken away from the dictator. So the observer is in some sense a disinterested third party. Nonetheless, when the dictator gave less than 50%, over half of the observers paid to punish. In both of these experiments, it's natural to think of the punishment as retributive punishment. The people who punish are probably not thinking that punishing the person will contribute to overall better consequences in the future. And they certainly weren't thinking that it would contribute to their own future good, because they weren't getting anything out of it. They were just paying to get the other person to have money taken away from them. Instead, what's plausible is that they feel angry and they think what that person did was wrong, unjust, unfair, and I'm willing to give up some of my own money to make the jerk pay. Again, that's why it's called altruistic punishment, because it doesn't seem to be in the financial self-interest of the punisher at all. So far then, we have evidence that people have a natural tendency for retributive punishment. Now, that probably just confirms a suspicion that you already had, but the results reveal this in a way that's tightly controlled, in tightly controlled experimental conditions. And so this is really, I think, an advance in our knowledge about people's retributive tendencies. Now that we've established our taste for retribution, the more important question for us is, does retributive punishment have any good effects? And again, the experimental work provides some really suggestive evidence. In a now classic experiment, participants played a series of these games, public goods games, in which they could contribute to a common fund as before. In this case, they played 20 games in a row. For the first 10 games, there was no opportunity to punish. It wasn't even mentioned. They didn't know anything about punishment in these games. They were just playing the games. Initial cooperation that for the first game was about 50% of the total available funds. That is, the total contributions were about 50%. But this declined dramatically over the 10 games. By the 10th game, cooperation had fallen to less than 20%. And then, before they played the 11th game, they were told, okay, now you can punish others at a cost to yourselves. The whole thing was explained to them just as I explained it to you a few minutes ago. What happened then? For that 11th game, contributions were immediately much higher. They were about 60%. So telling the people, okay, now you can punish people if you want, that immediately caused people to contribute more. And over the course of the rest of the games, contributions grew markedly, up to over 90% of the total available funds. These experiments, and many related experiments since in experimental economics, indicate that retributive punishment has significantly beneficial effects for contribution. And I want to draw out 3 points from this. First of all, as we saw, contribution diminishes in the absence of punishment. It went from 50% to roughly 15% over 10 trials. Secondly, contribution increases when punishment is exercised. We saw that between trial 11 and trial 20, where it went from being 15% in trial 10 all the way up to almost 90% in trial 20. The third point is, in some ways, I think the most striking. Merely knowing at the 11th trial that punishment was available led to significantly greater cooperation. Part of the explanation for this is that people anticipate that they will be punished if they defect. That is, if they fail to contribute to the common good, they think they will be punished, and so they're more likely to contribute. And indeed, it's not that people anticipate that others will calculate how to get advantage from punishment. People aren't thinking, oh, the other players are going to figure out what advantages they can get from punishing me. Rather, they think the other people are going to punish me retributively because they're going to think that I was being a jerk. And that seems to be an important part of securing cooperative behavior in these games. So this work provides reason to think that retributive punishment does work, that people respond to retributive punishment. It shapes their behavior for the better, at least in these experimental conditions. And part of the reason it works is because people feel inclined to do it, and they naturally anticipate that others will have similar inclinations. And all of that works to generate a kind of broad-scale basis for cooperation. As we've seen, many reject retributivism in favor of more humanitarian forms of social control, like rehabilitation or quarantine. Can we expect those approaches to be successful? Well, one worry about rehabilitation, of course, is its historic underperformance. And part of the explanation for its limitation is that some people are highly resistant to rehabilitative efforts. In the next lecture, we'll see a classic instance of this, the psychopath. The psychopath is not a good candidate for rehabilitation because, as we'll see, the psychopath is typically not remotely interested in changing. He doesn't think that there's anything wrong with him. Quarantine is a closer model of our current practice of keeping bad guys off the streets. And the quarantine approach to punishment can accommodate the problem of repeat offenders. Repeat offenders are just like people with persistent contagious diseases. You've got to keep them in quarantine. If some people are likely to commit crimes no matter what we do to rehabilitate them, it's still appropriate to incarcerate them if we think of punishment on the model with quarantine. But quarantine seems limited too, at least if it's presented as an explicit and global public model, because it looks like it wouldn't provide a deterrent to someone who plans to commit, say, just one major crime. So let's say a woman only wants to kill her husband. She's decided, I really want to kill my husband, and after that, man, I am never getting into a marriage again. I'm going to stay single because that's a disaster. So she would know that she's only going to commit the one crime, and she could be confident that the quarantine model would say, well, you're no longer a risk because your husband's dead and there's nobody else to kill, so it's over. There's no reason to punish you. The thing is that people are clever. We find the loopholes. And the quarantine model, if you offer it as a universal model of punishment, has a huge loophole here. People could anticipate the model and then respond appropriately in ways that take advantage of it. By contrast, retributivism provides full deterrence. It just says, I don't care if it's a one-off. I don't care if you're never going to get married again. You're still going to pay for the murder. Obviously, these issues about the effectiveness of punishment are large and complex, but they bring out one critical question that faces the free will skeptic. If we're to have a revolution in our penal practices, we need to attend carefully to questions about what will and won't work. It's widely agreed that we need some form of social control to minimize crime. However, as with many revolutions, it might be good to proceed with caution. If we need to reform our penal practices in light of the problem of free will, we still need to be sensitive to human nature. The human mind is not completely malleable. Just to take one obvious example that's completely outside of our topic, the way the visual system detects edges, that is pretty inflexible and universal. That's pretty much built into our genes, or built into our genes in our natural development. It seems to be a fixed feature of the human visual system as it develops. You wouldn't want to go to an optometrist who had prescriptions that ran against these basic facts of vision, who paid no attention to the fact that human visual systems detect edges in particular, pretty fixed ways. Similarly, you would want an adequate approach to social control to be sensitive to the limits and propensities of the human mind, and not to act like the human mind has no limits and no particular constraints at all. The evidence indicates that we are, in fact, extremely receptive to retributive punishment. Maybe we're equally receptive to other modes of social control, but before we can commit to a revolution, the free will skeptic should make sure that the revolution isn't going to run afoul of our natural propensities. That is, the free will skeptic who wants to promote a revolution should proceed with caution.